Well, what's in a name? We kind of mentioned something about names earlier, didn't we? Does anyone know what their name means?
Yes.
Okay, what's your name mean?
Doubter.
That's helpful, isn't it? Doubter, hang on. What's your name, sir?
Thomas.
Tom, oh, of course, yes.
I'm a strong spear.
A strong spear. I'm wisdom. Yeah.
I'm Rejoice.
Rejoice.
Yes.
Oh, I like that. That's nice.
Mine's Grace.
It means grace, doesn't it? Yeah. Do you know Anne also means grace? So if you've got the name Anne, that means grace. That's my middle name. That's the only reason I know that. I used to have a preacher at a church that I went to. Really nice man. His name was Cecil Mortimer Druitt. I remember that because it was an unusual name. I also remember that because Cecil means blind and Mortimer means dead. Blind dead Druitt. Funny. What's in a name? Ruth. Well, what does Ruth's name mean? Well, I really wanted it to be like the opposite of ruthless. And it is, and it's not. The Hebrew word Ruth means something else entirely. The Hebrew word Ruth means either friend or a sight worth seeing, i.e. that she was beautiful. There was an Old English word Ruth, which meant pity or compassion, for which we don't have that word anymore because we lost that. English being the weird language that it is, we can have ruthless, but we don't say the word Ruth anymore. So in Old English you would say, have ruth on me, sir, which meant have pity on me. This is, for those who are interested in these things fascinate me. This means it is part of an unusual class of words called orphan negatives. Okay? These are the words, when you start thinking about it, we have words where we don't have the positive in use anymore. Ungainly, disgruntled, dismantle, uncouth, unruly, unscathed. Not really words we actually don't use the word gainly, gruntled, mantle, couth, well, mantle as in this sense, couth, ruly, or scathed, do we? So there's lots of words that we have in the English language. Do you know that must make it really difficult for people to learn? Because we just don't have them anymore. So orphan negatives. I thought I'd mention that because I like the English language. Anyway, maybe you're just finding me ineffable, so let's get back to the book of Ruth. I love the book of Ruth. One of the two books of the Bible named after a woman. The other one being, of course, Esther. And Ruth is a love story. Actually, Ruth is 3 love stories. Ruth is the story of a love between a young woman and her mother-in-law. The story of love between a man and a woman, as in Ruth and Boaz, and between God and his people. In the book of Ruth, God revealed his plan for salvation more than 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. Ruth 1 tells us that the story is set in the time of the Judges, the time before King Saul and King David. In fact, the baby born at the end of the book of Ruth turns out to be King David's grandfather. Life was not easy during the time of the Judges. We are told in those days, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Sounds a bit like now, doesn't it? There was a famine in the land, so Elimelech took his wife Naomi and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, to the land of Moab. And that might seem to be quite a reasonable thing to do, to flee a famine. But actually, Elimelech and Naomi were disobeying God, because God had forbidden for his people to associate with the Moabites. They spent 10 years in Moab, and in that time Naomi buried her husband and both of her sons. She hears that the famine in Israel is over and decides to return home, bidding her daughters-in-law to return to their families and perhaps find new husbands. Neither wanted to leave her. But nothing was going to persuade Naomi to leave her mother-in-law. And she makes one of them, I think, are the greatest confessions of faith in the Bible. Now, if I can just find where Ruth is, somewhere around Judges, isn't it? I always look. One of those little books, they just move around, don't they? Just never in the same place as you last had them. And the minor prophets, I mean, they really do rearrange themselves every time. It would be funny if they did that. You'd think after 35 years I'd know where they were. She says, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and I." Despite the seemingly poor witness of this disobedient family, Ruth had come to know the living God, and she wanted to be with his people and dwell in his land. It's good news. Sometimes God uses us despite our failings. When Naomi realises that Ruth was determined, she stopped trying to persuade her, and the two women, widows, head back to Bethlehem, arriving just in time for the barley harvest. Ruth goes into the fields to glean for food, as the poor were allowed to do so. So that means that as people harvested the grain, some sheaves were, or not some sheaves, some stems were left behind, and they were allowed to go through and pick them up and glean corn. And this was, in scripture, they were told to do that so that the poor would be able to get food. So Ruth was gleaning in some fields, trying to find enough to make bread, to make flour. The law, as I say, forbade harvesters from picking up any ears of corn that they dropped, so that there would be provision for the poor. And Ruth happens, in one of those God circumstances, upon a field owned by a man named Boaz. He finds out who she is, and he shows her favour by allowing her to glean his fields for the entire harvest, offering her protection, and even, sneakily, instructing his workers to leave a few extra stalks for her. When she returns to Naomi in the evening and tells her what has happened, Naomi, who knows her family line and her husband's family line, says that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, or a guardian redeemer. Now, the whole thing about the story of Ruth doesn't make any sense whatsoever if we don't try to understand what that means. And it's a little complicated because it's a merger of two Old Testament laws. There was a land law. The principle is this: God owns the land. Land cannot be bought and sold permanently. It can only be mortgaged. So that if money was needed, land could temporarily go into the possession of another, but the seller always retained the right to buy it back, to redeem it, if their financial situation improved. Or the land could be redeemed by a relative of that person, a kinsman, if that person had died. So it always had ownership within a family. It could never be sold permanently. There was always the right to redeem it. I think that would be an interesting way to do business. I suppose it's like a land-based pawn shop, isn't it, really? You know, you can buy your land back. So the person who bought the land back would be a redeemer of the land, and if they were a family member, they would be a kinsman redeemer. So that's the land law. And then there was this other law that related to widows. And we see this a lot in the Old Testament. If a man dies before his wife conceives, the nearest relative of the husband, usually, but not always, the husband's brother, should marry her and have children in her brother's name, in the original husband's name. And again, this is about making sure that land stays within certain families and that possessions stay within people's families. So these laws had sort of become a bit mixed up at the time. So that a close relative of Elimelech, if they wanted to redeem the land that Elimelech had sort of mortgaged off when he went into Moab, they would also have to marry Ruth. So, you know, you buy the land, get a free wife. Although wives, as you'll find out, gentlemen, they're not really free, are they? They can be quite expensive. So Naomi is saying to Ruth that Boaz is this relative of Elimelech, and that maybe he could be a kinsman redeemer. He could try and buy back the land that Elimelech mortgaged before he went to Moab. And so Ruth continued to glean in Boaz's field until both the barley and wheat harvests were finished. So that tells us a bit of time has passed. At the end of each harvest, the men of the town would take turns using the threshing floor. Now, it's kind of a manly place. It's like the shed, as it were, of those times. The men would go to this place, which was a piece of land on a hill outside the town, where the grain would be separated from the stalks by beating the sheaves on the ground or having some oxen walk over them. The grain would then be thrown in the air, and the breeze would carry the chaff away, so the shells of the grain, bit that was useless, and the grain would fall on the floor. It was then put in piles, and the owner would stay overnight to guard his grain. There's a strong suspicion that they might also have a few drinks to celebrate the end of the harvest, and that's why they slept very soundly. So Naomi hatched a plan that came into effect when she knew Boaz was going to be spending the night at the threshing floor. As per Naomi's instructions, Ruth washed herself, anointed herself with oil, and changed her clothes. She then stealthily approached the threshing floor and lay down at Boaz's feet. This is not a euphemism. It sort of sounds like one, but it isn't. This was a submissive act, not a sexual act. So sometimes later, he wakes up and is startled to discover a woman lying at his feet. I don't know if any men in the room have experienced that. Don't answer. Ruth had put herself at Boaz's mercy. She had humbled herself before him, and she was, in effect, proposing marriage by asking him to redeem the land and her. And he understands it as a marriage request, because in 3:10, chapter 3, verse 10, he says, that she could have run after younger and indeed more attractive men, but she didn't. Now, quick aside, interrupting my own sermon, is this because of Boaz's mixed heritage? You see, Boaz's mother was Rahab. You know, Rahab the prostitute from Jericho, not an Israelite. And therefore, even though she was allowed to marry into the Israelites, and she married Boaz's dad, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, and Boaz was the result of that. Maybe he wasn't an eligible bachelor in that sense. Anyway, Boaz says, well, there's a closer relative who had the first choice to redeem the land. He didn't want to, because he didn't want a free wife. So Boaz accepted her, shown by him covering herself with his garment, claiming her for himself. He addressed her tenderly, he made a promise to her, and he gave her gifts, a massive quantity of grain. He kept his promises. He showed concern for Ruth, not allowing her to walk home alone in the night, or not letting her to be caught at the threshing floor, which would have endangered her reputation and future prospects. When you think about what kind of ladies might have gone to the threshing floor, or the slightly drunk men. Yes? As my father would have called them, women of negotiable affection. So he didn't want her to have that reputation. So Ruth expressed that she wanted to be part of the Israelite nation at the very beginning when she was talking to her mother-in-law. But she could not. She was inadmissible into the Jewish community because she was a Moabite. And God had spelt out, very clearly in the Old Testament. He said, a Moabite or an Ammonite shall not come into the congregation of the Lord. I tell you this because the one thing that prevented her from becoming one of God's people was her nature. The problem wasn't the law, it was her nature as a Moabitess. So Boaz, I'm making a point, you'll get there in the end. Boaz did for her what she couldn't do for herself. He redeemed her husband's land and made it possible for her to become one of God's people. You see, all human beings are in the same position as Ruth. Our nature Our sinful nature prevents us from enjoying a relationship with God. Our sin prevents us from entering God's presence. So what should we do? Well, we can learn some amazing lessons from Ruth's approach. Firstly, Ruth went to the right person. That's always helpful. She went to Boaz, her kinsman redeemer. Well, who is our kinsman redeemer?
Jesus.
Sunday school question. Or what's the answer is always Jesus. Of course it's Jesus. He is our kinsman because he became a man, a human being. He put on flesh and became as us. He is our kinsman. And he became our redeemer. He became a kinsman so that he could become our redeemer. He did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves.